This story begins with a great infernal war in the fortress of Endeavor. Explosions burst around as soldiers fall, cut down by massive orcs on the fortress walls. The soldiers shout in desperation to fight for survival, while the orcs raise battle cries, charging forward with relentless fury. Among them are wizard orcs, casting powerful spells that barrage the fortress's barrier, which, though resilient, begins to weaken under the relentless assault. The situation grows graver as the orcs activate their berserker rage. The fortress commander watches, stunned by the chaos, convinced it's only a matter of time before the barrier gives way. But it's not the sheer number of orcs that frightens him the most, it's the monstrous beast looming behind them, radiating a hellish aura across the battlefield. The scene of death and desolation fills him with dread. He senses this may be the end of his kingdom. Accepting his fate, he prepares to face defeat with honor. Meanwhile, the orcs continue their merciless rampage. Yet, something strange occurs. A celestial aura begins to emit from the fallen soldiers' corpses. Little flashes of light appear, drawing the attention of everyone present. Even more surprising, the corpses begin to rise, joining the fight against the living orcs. Amid the fray, the massive aura surrounding the orc assassin chief intensifies, unnerving the protagonist, who doubts that mere corpses will be enough to defeat such a powerful foe. Summoning his 4 best soldiers, the protagonist orders them to lead the undead army into battle. A fierce clash ensues, shredding anyone who dares to enter the radius of the chief orc. Yet, an elite soldier manages to engage the orc head-on, and surprisingly, a giant cat appears alongside, delivering a coordinated attack. The orc barely manages to dodge, but the final blow lands, leaving him visibly shocked. No one could believe that a necromancer could wield a sword with such skill or command such high-level summons, including creatures thought to be extinct. The tide of the battle turns in favor of the fortress, and the orc chief is astounded by this use of forbidden magic. He never imagined that mere corpses could push him to his limits. The protagonist, feeling victorious, decides that this formidable orc might just be the perfect body he has been searching for. He hurls a bone-bind spell at the beast, enveloping it. But in a flash, the orc's arm flies away, though it's merely an illusion. The beast charges with all its strength, only to be met by a massive wall of bones. Determined to overcome this foe, the protagonist activates his bone armor, meeting the orc's challenge to fight if he truly wants to change the world. The 2 warriors clash, their blades creating explosions with every strike, each knowing that their lives depend on this battle. The scene shifts back in time to Rothland Academy, the Empire's most prestigious school, where the most promising people gather, often concealing their true identities. Deep in a dungeon, a gray-haired man rebukes a green-haired boy named Andreas, who apologizes amid a collection of rare, extinct creatures. The anger stems from the failure of Andreas' experiment with necromancy on a body. Andreas, like his master Sharon, practices forbidden black magic, a skill punishable by execution, and so they experiment in secret, hidden in this catacomb. Sharon commands Andreas to clean up the failed experiment, and frustrated, Andreas begrudgingly complies, feeling trapped in a dangerous job that yields no personal benefit. Though it's the only place where he has access to the rare books on black magic he craves. After finishing, he reports to his master, who scolds him further. Andreas, desperate to learn more, asks for another chance. Reluctantly, Sharon grants it, ordering him to fetch supplies from the Vanilla cemetery but not without reminding him of his eternal debt for being saved as an orphan. Accepting his fate, Andreas heads out, resentful at not even being provided travel expenses. When he emerges from hiding, he finds himself in a bustling academy hallway where his classmates gawk at him, mocking his mere presence. Embarrassed, he marches past them, feeling like a spectacle. All he thinks about is how he didn't ask for any of this, and how he feels powerless to escape his circumstances. Despite it all, Andreas Cromwell, now a third-year student with no family or talent, continues to endure life at the academy. Seen as a cowardly, third-rate villain and considered the lowest of the low by his peers, he's a simple man forced to do favors for the strong while bullying the weak. He's resigned to his role as a despised character in the academy's social structure, but inwardly, he yearns for more. The story then shifts to another layer, introducing Makoto Kaneshiro, a 30-year-old man from a completely different world. Known in his original life as a member of the Special Forces who struggled to adjust to civilian life, Makoto had retreated into a game called The Great Sin, spending weeks immersed in this virtual world until a mysterious call revealed personal information about him. Panicked, he attempted to log out, but was instead transported into the game itself, awakening in Andreas's body, months before the current story begins. Now, with his mind fused with Andreas, Makoto's main objective is to escape from Sharon and avoid the dangerous main plotline that looms ahead. He remembers his two skills acquired from playing the game. One is random and unpredictable, while the other, dual core, allows him to wield both magic and swords, abilities he hopes will keep him alive in this unforgiving world. He selects a new ability called Evolution, hoping it will help him grow stronger over time. Determined to gain strength, Andreas, now Makoto, begins training rigorously. He dedicates himself to reading 3 forbidden books on black magic he found in a hidden den. But the most unsettling discovery he makes is a vampire girl imprisoned in a cage, her piercing red eyes observing him. When she asks for help to escape, he ignores her, though her offer to aid him in destroying Sharon lingers in his mind. The clever vampire had concluded he was scared of Sharon, and offered to end his life in exchange for freedom. It was probably because of his change in behavior. However, if he released her, there was no guarantee she'd let him live. However, would a higher being like her keep a promise to a human? As he travels to the Vanilla Cemetery, he contemplates the vampire's offer. However, her ominous aura makes him distrust her intentions, and he decides to investigate more about vampires before considering betrayal. Upon arriving at the cemetery, Andreas, now physically weakened from the journey, fumbles with the code to the cemetery gate, beginning yet another chapter in his quest for survival and power in this twisted world. They let him pass. Once there, the merchant tells him that he just took out exactly what he was looking for, a perfectly cold gentleman. Andreas, more pleased than he should be, decides to take it and put it in his suitcase, where it barely fits. However, he stops when he sees the name on a tombstone, recognizing it as belonging to Master Loren Nickel Lahill, a hermit who isolated high-self to train with his sword, dedicating a great deal of time daily to become a master. But despite his efforts, he died of old age. At that moment, Andreas recognizes this as a cruel part of the game, but now he thinks that if he can turn him into one of the undead, he could be one of the most powerful. Given that he's the only one who knows that Nickel had become a Aura Master, he could even summon a Death Knight with him. Determined, he asks the gravedigger Piman for the body. But Piman immediately rejects his request because they don't have permission from Sharon. Andreas decides to negotiate using his family ring, which the gravedigger notices has the seal of a count, something he could sell for good money. Finally, they seal the deal, and the gravedigger digs up the body. As they do, Andreas remembers the future he had already seen materializing, marking the start of his training as he prepares to oversee his first subordinate. Returning to his hiding place, his master orders him to prepare the body, which irritates Andreas, as he thinks they could at least give his body some rest. Angry but focused, Andreas sets to work, hoping to finish quickly so he can get back to studying. He doubts whether he'll be able to work with Nickel, assuming that a skeleton is the most he'll be able to revive and control with his powers, though he hopes to improve with the gift of evolution. After cleaning the entire area, he hears the voice of the vampire, asking if he really intends to continue being Karen's assistant. The protagonist approaches the chained vampire, confirming that he hoped to speak with her. She seems very pleased, sensing that he has made up his mind. However, Andreas first ponders how Sharon managed to capture her. He knows she wouldn't respond, however, as he read a book he figured out the answer. Annoyed, the vampire stares at him, warning him that her patience could expire, then moves away into the darkness. The protagonist stops her, telling her he will free her. She excitedly jumps at the bars, asking him to remove the chains. However, Andreas sets a condition: she must swear on her family's name not to send him to the grave. The vampire looks disappointed, but Andreas confirms his suspicions. A deal in her family's name becomes an unbreakable promise. She finally agrees, and at that moment, the game screen appears in front of Andreas, revealing that he has found an evolutionary specimen named Angela Lucifer with a 55% chance of evolution. Andreas continues examining the screen while the vampire watches him, puzzled as he seems to be interacting with thin air. Concentrating intently, Andreas realizes that this power allows him to evolve other entities that meet certain requirements, as long as they're not hostile towards him. Seeing this as the perfect opportunity to test it before using it on Nicole, he presses the evolution button. The vampire feels deceived until a red aura envelopes her, making her scream in pain. She attempts to stand up, only to collapse repeatedly from the pain, until finally, she falls unconscious. Andreas complains, seeing that she's unresponsive, and is unsure if the experiment worked. At least he discovered that he can evolve the abilities of other beings besides his own summons, which may allow him to enhance his own power. He then prepares to summon Nicole. Placing Nicole's body in the center of a magic circle, he starts the spell, filling the body with mana, which is challenging at his current level. The mana begins to permeate, stripping away the remaining flesh until only the skeleton is left. Andreas manages to revive it, confirming that he has summoned a legendary skeleton. This leaves him in awe, as the skeleton's level is very high, and it even seems to remember parts of its past life, introducing itself as Andreas' new soldier, a skeleton with a sturdy build, master of the sword, possessing skills that could only be acquired through toil and suffering. Afterward, Andreas rests in his room, counting down the days until the end of his teacher, though he's unable to rest much, knowing that his competition continues to grow. Reflecting on his new soldier, he sees Nicole's skeletal face. Realizing it is an impressive work, he decides to dress Nicole in clothes, since it'd be bad if anyone saw him, making him look more like a human. For his part, Nicole continues his training even after death, which Andreas thinks will be useful, especially because he's found a way to make use of his useless trait. He asks Nicole to teach him swordmanship, where he's shown a parchment explaining that talents are unlocked through achievements and improve over time, based on their level. The pinnacle is movement, a single word, and the lowest tier is a two-word phrase, which corresponds to mastery of the aura. With his dual core, Andreas realizes he can channel both his mana and aura, and no longer has to choose between them. He'll be able to use his heart mana and become a magic swordman, which is difficult at first. But once he overcomes the initial stage, he believes he could become as strong as Emperor Edmund, the man who founded the empire. His thoughts are interrupted when he feels a jab from Nicole, who reminds him to concentrate. Andreas is surprised by the skeleton's strength, which reminds him of his past in the armed forces, making him think that physical training should be easy for him. He's distracted again, receiving another jab, which irritates him, prompting him to threaten Nicole with sending him back to the grave. Sometime later, after finishing his training, he's surprised by how much his stats have increased, even more than he expected. It also strikes him as strange that Sharon hasn't summoned him all day, and he assumes the vampire won't cause problems for now, though he's uncomfortable with her evolution process. Andreas' focus shifts back to his animated skeleton. Since Nickel is undead, he cannot get tired, allowing him to train continuously, which seems excessive even for an undead. Andreas thinks that if he had magic potions, he could practice without tiring, but they are very expensive. Though he knows the ingredients, he's unsure of their cost, so he decides to return to school. Upon entering the classroom, he attracts the attention of his classmates, who wonder why he's returned. He tries to ignore them, attempting not to stand out, but can't help noticing a girl whose size and exhaustion. Class begins, with the teacher discussing herbs. Andreas is bored, recognizing that the lessons are identical to those in the solo game, waiting for something useful. Just when the teacher explains how to make a physical enhancement potion, Andreas listens in surprise. It seems the ingredients are different from what he knew, so he asks why other ingredients weren't added. However, this only draws attention to him, and the teacher mocks him, suggesting he make a soup out of them. His classmates laugh, and Andreas, confused, thinks that perhaps his recipe hasn't been discovered yet. He leaves class frustrated, disappointed that he didn't learn anything, but is determined to teach himself. As he leaves, he is watched by a blushing pink-haired girl. Later, as he attempts to make potions, he repeatedly fails, using up all the expensive ingredients he bought. Frustrated that he may know the ingredients but he needs a more reliable way to make it. Maybe if he had someone to help him, unfortunately no one would help him. At this moment, the blushing girl, Lucia Everlast, approaches. Andreas is confused, as she is a playable character in the game and known for her potions talent. Lucia mocks him for his failures, asking what he's working on, but he ignores her, hoping she'll leave. Annoyed, she speaks to him with a hint of threat. Andreas wants her to leave, but she comes closer, calling him senior, and suggesting they research together. Although Andreas sees no reason to refuse, he wonders why she chose him. She claims she just wants a research partner, but he doubts this, thinking she must have an ulterior motive. Lucia, however, simply wants Andreas' gratitude, hoping his talent will aid her in creating something new in their world. Andreas recalls Lucia's backstory. She became a potions genius not only because of her talent but because she's searching for a cure for her incurable illness, which even the best doctors have failed to treat. That's why she decided to seek the cure herself. However, finding it is complicated for anyone who hasn't played the game more than twice. Even then, Andreas doubts he knows the exact proportions to create the cure. His biggest problem is that being close to her could end badly if they discover his true identity, so he appears irritated, assuming she was looking for him. If he gets tangled with her, his life will be shortened, so he rejects her offer. She looks strange when he rejects her offer. To this, she taunts him, which grates on the protagonist's nerves as he realizes she knows of an ingredient only he should be aware of. Lucia admits she only discovered it instinctively when she heard him, offering both her help and her money. This bothers Andreas, who suggests she leave, thinking that interacting with her could cut his life short. Confident, she leaves, giving him time to think about it, knowing he will ultimately accept, but he's determined that he doesn't need to about it. Later, during practice, he fails to find a solution to his money problems, and his skeleton's distraction draws his attention, making Andreas realize that the skeleton truly understands him. But he can't get his financial troubles out of his head. The only viable option is to ask his younger sister for money, something his character in the game would originally do due to his pathetic personality. While walking through a town, he contemplates if this is really the way but seems to conclude he'll do it anyway. A girl recognizes him from a distance, surprised to see him with a book, thinking he's finally stopped being lazy, though she doubts he can do much with his trashy personality. Andreas can feel her judging stares and recognizes her as D'Alvin, the family's genius magician and another character who could unmake him with just a conversation. She was likely a childhood friend until she distanced herself due to the Cromwell family's debts. Andreas remembers her as a tender friend in their youth, but nowadays, even speaking with her would be dangerous. Under Lucia's gaze, he realizes he's already close to death, distancing himself even further from D'Alvin, who he remembers could likely end him. Choosing instead to ask his younger sister for money, he travels to the capital, Rodlin. Here, he meets his sister in a restaurant, who tells him how much she missed him, having sent him many letters. He apologizes for making her work hard, even as a lady of account household. She is finally revealed as Amy Cromwell, a very kind soul towards her brother. Andreas, embarrassed, can't speak, but she understands without words, assuming he's run out of money. Overjoyed, she ends up giving him an allowance, instructing him not to spend it carelessly. He thanks her, promising to repay her. As he takes his sister's money, he notices her looking at it, and confused, she asks where his ring is. He pretends he stored it to avoid losing it, but she doesn't believe him and becomes worried that he may have sold it. When he confirms this, she becomes both furious and saddened, leaving while telling him not to contact her. Feeling miserable, Andreas shouts after her, promising to get the ring back, recognizing that it was perhaps something deeply meaningful to her. As she leaves crying, the protagonist reflects on how miserable he feels. He resolves to retrieve the ring as soon as possible, feeling that life isn't worth living if it only consists of existing. Recalling his real-world life as a lone survivor facing endless darkness, he decides to make do with what he has and accept Lucia's proposal. And so, we return to his potion-making experiments, where Andreas tries to convince Lucia to train physically, but she prefers to sleep on a bench. This situation repeats day after day. He trains while she sleeps during her free time, occasionally working on potions. Sometimes, Lucia dares to help, which speeds up the work, but at other times she continues to sleep like a cat, infuriating Andreas with her lack of effort. Her only response to his complaints is a lazy, "Give me a candy!" However, her instructions for potions are often very accurate, leading the protagonist to wonder if, despite his financial hardship, this partnership might actually be worth it. Just when he uses the last drop from his bottle, he completes the formula and receives a notification from the game, indicating that he has successfully created an intermediate-grade physical reinforcement potion. Euphoric, he alerts Lucia, who believes he's failed again. However, Andreas, with a genuine smile of happiness, tells her that it worked. This grants him the talent of making ordinary enhancement potions, a skill that can evolve. Although the success rate is only 32%, a lower rate than for the vampire, he realizes he can also evolve traits or anything else that meets the requirements, though he decides to set this aside for now due to the low success rate. Lucia checks the formula and, satisfied, states that it has no side effects and can be used daily. She enthusiastically instructs Andreas to present it to the potions examination committee, but he prefers to delegate that task to her. She agrees, saying that thanks to his hard work, the potion was very easy to make. The protagonist realizes that all the time she spent sleeping had been intentional, yet he lets go of his anger. Later, he checks on Angela's evolution, which still has 14 days left. She lies on the ground, her body burning, suffering intensely. Beneath all this suffering, Andreas feels he should see something else. He then heads to his first exam, feeling calm, thinking Lucia will pass easily. However, he is concerned about the next part, where he must overcome the castle towers. At this stage, he knows that his magic and swordsmanship skills have increased enough to pass the exam. He recalls that afterward, he must visit his vampire. In the distance, he sees a blonde girl talking to Diane, asking if she's excited for the next group exam. Diane responds somberly that she's fine, no matter who she's paired with, as she is a model student. The blonde changes the topic, asking if she's considered the possibility of ending up in a group with someone as hated as the protagonist. This makes Diane swallow nervously. As they arrive at the station, a teacher steps out to explain the exam. Groups will be randomly formed with 4 people from the departments of Wizards and Warriors, along with a supervisor. They have until Monday to finish it. When the groups are announced, Andreas feels everything is lost, seeing that he's paired with other marginalized students with equally poor reputations. Among them is a hazard cult fanatic, Pri, and a ruthless killer, Vivian Belkin, also known as the Lunatic. His bad luck is further confirmed when he sees Christopher Groney, who immediately belittles him for attempting to train as a warrior despite being a magician. Chris, known for his bullying, is only tempered when Hazard, another student, tries to smooth things over, worried about the team's lack of social harmony. This irritates Vivian, who feels insulted, and the scene makes Andreas remember that their supervisor will also be a problem. Their supervisor, Ivy, is a real gangster, and Andreas, ready for the next step, is asked by his teacher to return alive. The protagonist doubts that he'll achieve this with such a group. After boarding the train, Ivy formally introduces herself as their supervisor, Ivy Clare, outlining their mission: to investigate a village in Yorick Male territory, where the local lord has gone missing. The investigation team, however, has already lost 2 researchers, prompting the mercenary guild to take on the quest. The protagonist, with his most aggressive supervisor, encounters a character whom he only knows will eventually become Laura's young teacher, skilled yet possessing a terrible attitude. Andreas experiences this firsthand when, with a single condescending glance, this character mocks Andreas's attempt to train as a knight. Annoyed, Andreas chooses to ignore these criticisms, only to later learn that the supervisor's irritability is due to an addiction to cigarettes, which makes her prone to aggressive mood swings. Finally, they reach the town, where they are awestruck by a grand castle owned by a local lord, who regrets the recent kidnapping of his nephew, his only family. Just before the man leaves, his butler whispers something in his ear while casting a suspicious look at Andreas. Apologizing for his employer, the butler suggests they should stay until morning, but Ivy, the supervisor, insists they leave immediately. Once outside, Ivy approaches Chris, who is caring for the team and polishing his sword, wondering why the Lord seemed so calm despite his nephew's disappearance. Andreas, noticing Ivy's unease, suggests that something in the Lord's attitude was suspicious. He points out how strange it is that only 2 investigators were sent over the last 2 months, implying that there may be a cover-up. The butler's insistence that they remain in the castle for the night is especially suspicious, so Ivy decides to follow Andreas's suggestion and go directly to the scene. The team hurries through the forest in a carriage, ignoring Chris's suggestion to stop and rest. As they approach the village, everyone feels an odd vibration. Chris, growing uneasy, watches as their driver begins to behave erratically, seeming out of his mind. The horses also appear crazed, and Ivy strikes the carriage door in an attempt to escape, but they ultimately crash into the village gate. In the town center, the group finds the driver with broken bones and hollow eyes, like others in the village who resemble zombies, aimlessly dancing under the moonlight. Seeing the eerie scene, Chris, disturbed, orders Andreas to use his magical knowledge to identify what's happening. Andreas discerns that more than just a mana anomaly is at work, it's a case of dark magic. In the shadows, they notice a small zombie exhibiting superhuman strength. Hazard examines a person, noting the extreme wear on its feet from constant dancing, suggesting a powerful curse. Andreas concludes that someone is maintaining the villagers' unnatural vitality. With growing tension, the group decides to investigate further. Sensing that they are dealing with a formidable dark magician, she hits her head in frustration. Andreas, reflecting on the fact that Andreas didn't die here in the story, means that if they had stayed the night, the Baron would have covered it all up. Ivy, undeterred, leads them to the ruler's house. They find it surrounded by undead who are burned on stakes. Inside, they encounter numerous bodies of the dead which they identify as the remains of the previous investigation team. Andreas realizes that this situation is beyond them, as they are dealing with a powerful dark magician exchanging emotions for power, the essence of black magic. The bright bearing on the stake outside the house appears to be part of a ritual, making everyone nervous except for Ivy, who pushes forward, determined to track down the perpetrator. As they press on, they notice a massive horde of zombies gathering outside. Recognizing this as the magicians making a move, Hazard nervously requests orders from Ivy. She, unsure of what to do, instructs Hazard to look for an escape route. Hazard barely makes it far before a wave of zombies intercepts him, but Chris comes to his aid. As they fight the zombies, a sudden burst of fiery light erupts, throwing them into the air. Andreas, disoriented, recalls a flashback to his last mission as a soldier, and hears Ivy in the distance, calling to him. When he doesn't respond, Ivy hauls him over her shoulder, as Hazard does the same for Chris, and Vivian breaks a window to make their escape. Running at full speed, Andreas comes to his senses, seeing the horde closing in. He uses grease to make them fall, then utilize Earth's shield to block their path, but Ivy discourages him from expending his energy, reminding him he's not alone. Instead, she urges him to focus on finding the dark magician, believing Andreas's mana detection skills can locate the source of the magic. Concentrating, Andreas searches through the swarm of zombies in every corner of the city, eventually pinpointing the magician's location and sharing it with the group. Ivy dashes off ahead, leaving the others behind. From a nearby window, a masked figure watches her approach. Ivy breaks down the door, something Andreas has come to expect from her. However, this time, an energy shield blocks her path. Behind the shield stands a girl wrapped in bandages, whose very presence seems to cause Ivy pain. Ivy, visibly shaken, mutters, "Sister," looking utterly lost. Unable to breach the shield, Andreas suddenly hears a voice in his mind, repeating the word, "regrettable," over and over, telling him he's like a moth drawn to a flame. Above, a hole opens in the mana dome, and a voice declares this to be God's will, demanding that Andreas kneel before the sloth. Recognizing this as a reference to the game's main antagonist, Andreas realizes he's caught up in the storyline of the Great Sin, in which the 7 deadly sins are embodied in separate artifacts known as the Apocalypse Codex. When united, they have the potential to summon the final boss of the game. Ignoring his confusion, Andreas moves swiftly to dodge the zombie hordes but remains unsettled, aware that he's now facing a scenario that isn't part of the main story. He knows that the problem at hand is beyond his power to resolve, leaving him deeply unsure of his next steps. The protagonist, alone, sets out to find the others. He soon finds Vivian, who is euphoric and gleefully cutting down the zombified villagers. Andreas asks Hazard about Vivian's behavior, suspecting that something has made her lose control. Hazard admits he doesn't know, but Andreas doesn't believe him entirely. Nevertheless, he noticed that Hazard abandoned his injured comrade to fend for himself in this situation. Andreas plays along with Hazard's story and informs him that their supervisor, Ivy, is trapped. Just then, a voice interrupts them, sneering at the pitiful scene, criticizing Vivian for attacking innocent villagers. Realizing this voice belongs to the Dark Wizard, Andreas watches as the Hazard flees, pretending to go help Ivy. Andreas decides to let him go for now, as he must deal with Vivian, who is still lost in her frenzy, mercilessly destroying villagers. He assumes that dark magic is controlling her, but he's afraid to interfere directly. Just as she's about to be attacked by 3 zombies, Andreas deciphers that she couldn't dodge. Vivian regains control, leaving Andreas amazed at her reflexes and her crazed look. The voice from earlier admits she's a waste. The masked figure reveals himself, and Andreas approaches him calmly. The dark magician acknowledges Andreas's bravery and proposes a test. He casts dark magic, trapping Andreas and lifting him into the air. Andreas's face fills with fear as he watches his fingers begin to disintegrate, along with the rest of his body. As nearly nothing remains of him, his vacant expression shifts to his true self, the soldier, who believes he's dreaming. He finds himself in the middle of a battle, gravely injured from an explosion. Rising, he sprints across the battlefield, searching for his companions. Suddenly, he stops, one bloodshot eye focusing on the remains of a comrade, destroyed by fire. Realizing it is Shohei, he runs to help, screaming in desperation, unsure of what to do. As he watches his friend's face, it morphs into that of his father, who reaches out to hand him something, a ring, the same one he exchanged for Nickel's body, marking him as a true descendant of the Cromwell family. With his final words, his father urges him not to complicate matters over the family but instead to be happy with Amy, leaving Andreas with a lump in his throat. From afar, the masked man observes the dome created to trap him. Suddenly, an arm emerges, glowing with immense power until it shines like the sun. The dark wizard is baffled as Andreas, with fierce eyes, seems to have broken the curse of sloth. The protagonist, now synchronized with his real personality due to his trauma, displays exceptional combat ability from his army days. He turns to the dark wizard, remarking that the curse of laziness is just a simple enchantment amplifying traumas or perhaps wielded poorly. Infuriated, the magician unleashes a powerful black ray, which Andreas dodges thanks to his special forces training. This only angers the wizard further, who intensifies his attacks. Andreas realizes his opponent isn't particularly strong, yet defeating him will require necromancy. The confused magician demands to know who Andreas really is. In response, Andreas activates his necromancy skill, detecting 23 deceased but only able to raise 9, summoning skeletons to aid him. The dark wizard, momentarily stunned, realizes Andreas may have ties to a mage congregation, and Andreas declares he's come to acquire the Page of Sloth on behalf of the congregation. However, he doubts the skeleton's strength and easily obliterates them with his powers. Andreas quickly takes refuge, conjuring an earth shield. Andreas, meanwhile, calls for someone, irritated and declaring Andreas weak. The magician hurls another attack, which is unexpectedly deflected by Nickel, surprising the dark wizard. He holds an object. Andreas recognizes it as the Page of Sloth. Frustrated that he's forced to use the page, the wizard summons monstrous hands to engage the skeletons, determined to eliminate them. Andreas dodges effortlessly while Nickel blocks the blows with his sword. However, the magician increases the speed of his attacks, complicating matters for Andreas, who suspects the magician can't fully control the Page of Sloth. He charges forward, running toward Nickel, who takes the brunt of the next blow, sustaining damage. Andreas, injured, curses him for striking down his skeleton. The masked man, impressed with Andreas's persistence, orders an attack. A massive hand approaches, leaving no apparent escape. Andreas smiles as Nickel, recently resummoned, appears behind the magician, slicing him in two. The battle concludes. Andreas notices the Lord's butler and deduces he's involved in gathering the Page of Sloth. The page transforms into a cube, marking itself as the 7th chapter of the Codex Apocalypse, granting 321% mana recovery speed. Knowing he must conceal the cube, Andreas gives him the cube to keep among his summons. Left alone, he observes the wizard's barrier, still intact. Though he could let it dissipate as others have, he chooses to examine it further. As he touches it, he's absorbed, entering a miniature version of Vivian's mind, where he sees her visibly terrified, alone in a room. Invisible to her, he sits, attempting to calm her by saying he's here to help. Vivian, still frightened, cries, and Andreas, unsure how to comfort children, remembers seeing her memories, mistreatment at the hands of a noblewoman, later discovered to be the second wife of Count Belcam. The story of Belkin's twisted family unravels, revealing that her father belongs to a family of sore men and had hoped for a male heir. But with only Vivian as his child, a tragedy happened. Alone and unprotected, she grew a seed of madness, eventually reaching a point where she took the lives of all her swordsmanship teachers with a sadistic smile. Andreas knows he can't erase Vivian's past, but he wishes to help. He asks why she's crying, and she admits no one has ever offered to help her. Moved, Andreas reassures her, pointing out her remarkable fencing talent, which no one else has noticed. Confused, she explains she's never held a sword, and when she tries, she's reprimanded. Determined to help, Andreas proposes training her in secret, and thus begins guiding her fencing skills. Over the next month, he supports her, even watching over her as she sleeps. One day, Vivian searches for him, calling across the courtyard. Finding him, she reminds him not to break their pact. Over time, her combat skills improve significantly, earning praise from her fencing masters. Despite the accolades, she remains insecure. When asked why, she confesses that although she practices and receives recognition, Mr. Fairy won't reveal himself to her. She looks away, admitting she believes it's because she's a bad girl, resigned to the thought. However, surprised, her father arrives unexpectedly to congratulate her, acknowledging her skill. For the first time, Vivian receives her father's praise, something she had never dared to dream of. Now an adult, Vivian wishes she could linger in this beautiful dream but accepts that it's time to wake up, grateful for the guidance that has helped her move forward. Andreas takes her hand, supporting her as she faces her path forward. Intertwining their little fingers, Vivian is grateful for everything and thanks him. Blushing, she says goodbye, thanking him for showing her that beautiful dream. As the dome breaks, they both remain with their hands intertwined, and the protagonist now believes he can trust her. The group is reunited and deduces that the Baron is behind all this. Ivy, who broke the barrier on her own, ordered Andreas to take the head of the butler. With excessive fury, she orders the group to head to the Baron's castle immediately. They begin to move quickly, noticing the obvious killer instinct of their supervisor, which is somewhat understandable given that Chris has died and Hazard continues to be missing. In the castle of the Baron, Ivy, furious, threatens a knight with her sword. The other knights surround her, but she warns them that with her authority as an assistant teacher and academy supervisor, any person who defends the Baron will be executed for treason. This scares the protagonist, who carries Chris on his back. Raising what remains of the butler, Ivy tells the knights that he was responsible for what happened in Tyrim. After this revelation, the knights agree to let them pass. Inside, the Baron waits in a room with his son, Edel, who has become a gigantic, mana-impregnated, morphed mass. The Baron acknowledges that his son should have died months ago, but a man in a robe offered to help. Desperate, he accepted, even if it meant leaving his poor boy in that sorry state. The Baron apologizes, saying he only wanted to save him, which causes Ivy's anger to boil over. She grabs him by the neck and throws him to the ground, expressing that those words should be directed at the people he and his butler harmed. Ivy orders the team to investigate and take the creature. Without thinking twice, Andreas creates a sharp rock to end it, causing the man to cry and run to what was once his son. This surprises everyone, including Ivy, who asks Andreas why he acted without waiting for her orders. Andreas responds coldly, saying that any creature born of black magic must be exterminated before it has a chance to make a move. Afterward, the Baron is arrested by the investigative team, who also transport what remains of his son. Andreas and Vivian give statements that confirm the involvement of a black magician. The team takes the Baron away and sends them home. As they walk, the protagonist reflects on the consequences Baron will face. Despite everything, he believes the Baron should be thanked for having saved his son from the cruel experiments he would have suffered if he had lived. Vivian, sensing his thoughts, remarks that Mr. Fairy saved the man's son from suffering. The familiarity of her statement almost triggers the protagonist's memory of the little girl Vivian had been. However, he manages to come back to himself and pretends not to understand her. His voice falters, but luckily, they are interrupted by Lucia, excitedly showing them something at her tablet. Lucia mentions news that they are being recognized as the brave heroes who defeated a dark wizard and that Hazard is still missing. She also informs them that the potion has already been presented to the council. With this, the protagonist seeks some peace, but it does not last long. Lucia insists that they celebrate their victory, and that he should invite her to dinner. The protagonist knows the reward should be shared between him and Vivian. He feels that Lucia, the Nico, is trying to take advantage of him. Lucia finally notices Vivian's presence and awkwardly recognizes her as the other girl in the photo. She introduces herself late and insists that Andreas take her to dinner to celebrate his achievement with the potion. Luckily, when he tells her he has not received the money yet, she gives up and leaves, reminding him they will meet at the Magic Tower tomorrow. The next day, Andreas is running at full speed with Lucia on his back. Annoyed by their pace, Lucia complains about not being able to sleep. They finally arrive, and the receptionist admits them into the Magic Tower, which constantly changes. Andreas advises Lucia to stay alert and not get lost, but she seems more interested in him and Vivian relationship. Nervous under her insistent gaze, Andreas changes the subject. Lucia again insists on dinner, bothering him repeatedly, but they are interrupted by a voice accusing them of being shameless. Alerted, they notice the presence of a man with a blindfold and an eagle on his shoulder descending from the sky. This man is Bart Alvin, the owner of the Magic Tower. A brief comment is made about the Magic Tower, explaining that it creates magical infrastructure and other magical items, with remuneration dependent on its fame. Bart is the well-known leader of the Alvin House and the current master of the Magic Tower. He's also the father of Lady Alvin. Ignoring Andreas, Bart diverts his attention to Lucia, asking if she is the daughter of Viscount Hollington. She confirms this and formally introduces herself. Bach dismissively tells them that no one will remember their names since they lack the reputation to back them up. Bach then casts a teleportation spell. Lucia whispers, amazed by his use of complex dimensional magic, but her remarks provoke him. With 2 flashes, he teleports them to a new room where hooded men, the potion's exam jury, are present. They are surprised to see Bach, who inquires about the status of the exam. The examiners confirm that only thing left is to question how the potion is made.